friends, welcome to the Connected Mom podcast. We're so glad you're here. I'm Becky Harling, your host, and we like to have real conversations on the Connected Mom podcast. Conversations that help you connect more deeply with God, more empathically with your fellow moms, and more intentionally with your child. And this conversation today is so near and dear to my heart because I have somebody really precious to me and close to me that has been diagnosed with autism. And I know some of you moms out there listening, you've had kids diagnosed with autism, and you're like, finally, somebody's talking about this. And how do we hang on to our faith? And how do we connect with our kids? And I have good news for you today. We have an amazing guest with us today. Her name is Jessica Hurlbut. I hope I said that right, Jess. Jessica
It's
Hurlbut.
robot, just like you
Okay,
pronounce
Hurlbut.
it.
Anyway, Jessica is a writer, an author, a pastor's wife, a mom. She has two kids that are on the severe end of the spectrum with autism. She's also a mom who has adopted kids, which is also near and dear to my heart because I have an adopted grandson. And she and her husband live in upstate New York. They're both pastors, but Jess also ran an incredible race. I mean, I'm proud of myself when I make it to the gym and can put away 2 miles on the treadmill. She ran like, holy moly, like over 125 miles. Is that right, Jess? Welcome.
Well, let me correct you, I attempted to run 125 miles on National Adoption Day to represent the 125,000 kids in foster care who need to be adopted. I made it 68 miles, so
Wow. I listen, I am still impressed. 68 miles, that's incredible. I mean, that's
yeah, it was
crazy. How
crazy.
long did it take you to do that?
Oh my gosh, I lost track of time. I started, I think, at 9 a.m. and I've stopped running because I literally couldn't walk at it was about 4 a.m. I think
Wow,
that
you ran all through
that
the
night.
night.
So straight through, all through the day, all through the night. Yep.
Oh,
Yeah,
wow.
and, yeah, it was pretty amazing. Actually, we had a bunch of community runners that found out that I couldn't finish the run. Word had spread that I was doing this run to raise awareness, right, for adoption for these kids in foster care. And so at the middle of the night, I get into the car because my husband's, like, convincing me because 'cause I'm hobbling. It was actually through a snowstorm. Living in upstate New York, you don't ever know what the weather's gonna be like. It was our first snowstorm of the year in November. And so I got back in the car and he says, "You need to go on Facebook Live and tell everybody you can't run anymore." And I said, "It's 4 a.m. Who am I telling I can't run anymore?" And he goes, "Everyone's up. They're all following the run." And I thought, "What?" And so I went online. There's like hundreds of people watching this live stream. And I'm like, "Oh, I'm such a failure." But what was so cool was I announced, that I was hurt and I couldn't run. And all these runners said, "I'll do the next 5 miles. I'll do the next 5 miles." So we actually finished the run right on time within 24 hours with a bunch of our community. And ever since then, that was 5 years ago on National Adoption Day, we do the run again, and it's run by over 100 people, like a relay style. So somebody runs 5 miles and they pass a baton off to the next person. And so we run our whole county in upstate New York. It's pretty
That
amazing.
makes me want to cry,
It was so
because I
beautiful.
just have such a heart for these kids that are in foster care and adoption.
Mhm.
And I just love that
Yep.
you're doing that in honor of them. So many of them feel unwanted and, uncared for,
Or
invisible.
invisible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you're doing something for them. All right. Let's talk a little bit about autism. Today, as we're recording this, you told me it's National Autism Day or National Autism Awareness Day.
World autism. Yep.
Autism Awareness. And I think for parents, sometimes just this is the most scary diagnosis because they wonder, how am I going to connect? So, first of all, tell us a little bit about your story with that.
Sure. Yeah, so my daughter we have 5 kids, and my oldest daughter was diagnosed when she was 3, and I remember not even knowing what autism was. That would have been back in 2012. I didn't know a single person with autism. I didn't know a child with autism. I remember seeing a couple commercials on TV because they were trying to raise awareness back then. But I even then, it's embarrassing to say this, but I remember seeing a commercial before we even had kids and saying to my husband, "What is autism? Is it like your kids misbehave and then you just label them with this autism diagnosis?" That's like how little I knew, which is embarrassing to say that now in hindsight, but just to give you a perspective. So when we got the diagnosis, it was very much a like from left field, what? Our daughter, when she was 2, she just cried a lot. She was super like, she got into everything. She walked at 9 months. She was, like, really active, but very didn't speak and cried a lot, was always kinda having meltdowns, and we just thought it was a personality thing. We started early intervention, and then we went to a developmental center. She was diagnosed at 3. And I think it took us a long time to even really understand what does this mean. And back then they just said classic autism. They do the diagnosis different now, but it's really the highest needs. So there's like a level 1, 2, 3, and she has the highest needs, needs the most support. We use the word severe. Some people don't like that, but I think it's helpful for people that aren't in the context of autism world to
Yeah.
understand because autism is a spectrum. Yeah, so we were blindsided by that diagnosis, and when we finally kinda got to grips with it, I had a son, and when he was 3, he was also diagnosed with severe autism. We went to the same developmental center, drove down the same highway, met with some of the same doctors, and that diagnosis was harder in a lot of ways because, like I said, we were kinda blindsided with my daughter, and then with my son, it was like that secret fear. "Oh, no, what if our" you know, future children have autism. So there was this underlying fear. And we actually had a doctor say to us, because you have a child, with severe autism, you really have a 1 in 4 chance that future children will also struggle in this way. So we went back and forth. Do we want more kids? We want a big family. Do we trust God? Do we make
Wow.
this decision? But we really felt like if we just felt like we didn't want to make a decision based upon fear and that we were going to trust God. And so the second diagnosis for our son in a lot of ways was even harder because it was more of a blow to our faith. Whereas the first was like, what's autism? What does that mean for our life? And our second was kind of like, God, where are you?
Yeah.
Like we chose to honor you and to choose faith over fear and all of those cliche things. And here we are in the same boat. And now I have 2 kids that I will care for the rest of my life unless a miracle happens. So a lot of even what I write about is just that season of like honestly, just being honest, disillusionment, in my faith and God and even being angry sometimes at God and just walking through all of that as pastors and as people who love Jesus. How do I reconcile what I'm facing, and believe God still has a future for my family and my kids and myself and
It
yeah.
is it that is so hard, and so you look at your kids, and I'm sure you think, "Well, will they ever live independently? Who will take care of them?" And yes, and all those things, and so tell us a little bit about what life looks like now. How old are they both? Are they verbal? Are they not verbal? What does school look like?
So my daughter just turned 15. And she has a lot of words. She can't really converse with you back and forth a lot, but she tends to mimic. She loves like to quote movie lines and kind of say the same thing over and over again. So she has a lot of words, but not a lot of conversation. She still struggles with meltdowns. Honestly, this year has probably been the hardest year for her. She went through a great stint when she was like, 10, 11, 12, where she would have an occasional meltdown, but she's really struggling again. I don't know if it's
Mhm.
hormones or what, but just self-injuring and
Wow.
all kinds of
Yeah.
stuff. So that's been hard. My son is also on the severe end. He is 11. But he never had any meltdowns. It's so interesting, there's that quote that says, if you meet one child with autism, you've met one child with
Yeah.
autism. My son's personality is very, very different. He is very happy, go lucky. He's even cuddly. He'll sit in your lap, whereas my daughter just kind of doesn't like affection. And he's always happy. But he's severe too because he lives in his own
Mhm.
world. He's even less verbal. I'd say he'd almost be that not considered nonverbal. He has words, but he chooses not to
Okay.
use them. So if you ask him a question, he will respond with a yes or a no, or what do you want for dinner? He'll say a food, but he's more severe because he lives in his own little world also. It just presents itself
Mm,
differently for him.
mm.
He's very happy and he loves school and, he loves people. So just very, very different, but both of them struggle socially.
Yeah. So are they in a public school, private school, special school? What does that
Sure.
look like for you guys?
Yep. So they're in ABA. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. That stands for Applied Behavior Analysis. So we're super blessed in the county that we're in. Well, New York State has a lot of funding for special needs, but our county in particular has a 40-hour a week ABA program that both of my kids attend, which is huge because a lot of times children on the spectrum can't it's not free. It's hard to find ABA, which is just a particular education system for kids on the spectrum. And if you can find a school that offers that, you usually have to pay like a private school, and it's usually very, very expensive. I have a friend in Ohio who spent $36,000 for her child to go for 1
Wow.
year
Wow, wow, wow.
to ABA
Wow.
school. So it's fully funded by the state. It doesn't matter what your income is. So both of our kids go there full time. So we're really blessed to have some very good resources in our area, but that is not the case in so many states and so many counties where people just have a lot of times they're in special ed classrooms and they might offer an hour or something of ABA a day, which is not enough for some of these kiddos.
So then on top of the 2 kiddos with autism, you also have adopted, and a lot of adopted kiddos come, I mean, probably I would say probably all of them come with some form of trauma in their background, even if it was in vitro. So how does that look for you? I mean, it you must be overwhelmed.
Well, that's why I said, they always say in writing, write about what you're an expert at. And I'm like, well, I'm an expert at being overwhelmed and limited by my life. That's what I can write.
Well, it's so okay, let me interrupt you for a second because I need to tell our listeners the name of your book is Unlimited Motherhood. And I'm sitting here having a conversation with you and I'm like, holy moly, I would be overwhelmed because I know a little bit about both of these issues. So continue.
Yeah, so we adopted a sibling group of 2 through foster care. I actually have an older son too, who's our biological son. He's 16 and he's smart as a whip, and we say he's like 16 going on 30 because he's been a caretaker for all the other
Yeah,
children
I'll
with
bet.
us since he was like 5. So he's a pretty special boy. Yeah, so we adopted a sibling group of 2 from foster care. As newborns, we got them. Began fostering them right from the hospital. And then I found out I was pregnant for my son, Jacob, who has autism in the middle of that. So we ended up having 3 babies under 1 at one point. Yeah, so I get the overwhelmed part. I feel like I got a badge in that area. So but yeah, it's honestly I'm so glad. I remember when we toyed with the idea and talked about the idea of fostering and adopting. I remember some of my family, particularly my mom, being like, "Are you crazy?" Because my daughter had just gotten diagnosed. She's like, "You're going to add other children to this mix?" But during that season, one of the things, because I spent, Becky, 8 years pretty much. I went from working full time to part time to not being able to work at all, which many people decide to be a stay at home mom. But this was not the like, oh, let's braid your hair and make cookies stay at home mom. It was like oh, you're crying all day long stay. Like it was not what I envisioned. And I went 8 years because my daughter, especially when she was young, her meltdowns were so severe and unpredictable. I pretty much for 8 years couldn't leave my house.
Wow.
Couldn't do restaurants, absolutely could not do family vacations, couldn't do, pretty much anything, even parks. I mean, I would take my kids to the park. She'd have a meltdown within 5 minutes. I'd be carrying her over my shoulder, making all the other kids leave the park, be a scene. And so you just get to this place where you almost like don't want to leave because you know something bad is going to happen. And so I went through this season of 8 years and really struggled and complained to God a lot, saying, God, I used to do ministry and I used to do all these things and now I can't even leave my house. And he just always he just kept saying to me this one phrase, and it made me angry, honestly. He'd say, Jess, what's one thing you can do now that you couldn't do
Mm,
before?
mm.
And I was like, are you kidding? Nothing. I can't leave my house. Remember, Jesus? But that phrase went over
Mm.
and over for like 2 weeks in my head. What is one thing you can do now that you couldn't do before? And I just was like upset by that phrase. I don't know how to answer this. And then about 2 weeks into just that kind of thought, just marinating in my mind, I found an old journal back when I was probably 19 in college. And it had pages of me talking about how I wanted to adopt one day. And it was like God had me find that right at that moment, and I knew he was just saying to me, Jess, I know it sounds crazy. It doesn't make sense. But if you were ever going to adopt, wouldn't you want to be home full time? Wouldn't you want to bond with a child that's not biologically yours and invest that time? He goes, can't you see that I've brought you to this season for a reason? And so it was just almost this perspective shift of me thinking, oh my gosh, my life's so horrible and there's nothing I can do, God, and then him just opening my eyes and being like, no, I'm here in this season with you, in this hidden season. I have purposes for you and for your family. And so we started fostering, and yeah, like I said, our family was like, are you crazy? But now I look back and we didn't know. Even at that time, we did not know. I think my daughter was newly diagnosed, but we didn't know we'd have another son who'd also have severe autism. Like, we didn't know what our future is going to be. And in a lot of ways, I was thinking, and I know this is a bad perception, but some people look at adoption and they think, oh, we're going to save the kids, right? And that's not a good perception to have, but right, the heart's right, right?
Right.
Like, I want to help the children, right? But now I look back and it was like God was helping
Mhm.
me. He knew. Like, we have two, I have a relationship with my adopted daughter and my son. Um, it's different, right? Like, I love all of my kids equally, but like my oldest now has a buddy to play basketball with and pick on that he can't with my son with autism. Like, I have a daughter, and you can even just see as they're getting older, my adopted son, his name is Isaac, he rooms with my biological son Jacob, and they are absolute best friends. And we were just talking the other day, we were driving by some construction, and Isaac's 11. He says, Mom, when I get older, I'm going to build a house. I'm like, oh, that's cool, buddy, because construction's like kind of in our family. I'm like, you could totally do that. That'd be awesome. And he goes, and I have an extra bedroom just for Jacob so he can
Mm.
live with me forever. And I'm like,
Oh,
oh my God.
I love
Yeah.
that.
So you see this beautiful, like God was looking ahead and knowing what we were going to face and almost giving us like these children that we knew we would need and that our children with autism would need. Like, I don't know. It's just such a beautiful picture of like trusting God, even in the middle of hard seasons, because he does have a
Well, and
purpose.
it's interesting because a lot of times there's a perception out there that kids with autism cannot connect, right? But they truly can. That's not true. And so you look at how close your son with autism is to your adopted son, and they're like best friends. And I love that.
Like, he won't it's so cute, he won't even my son Jacob is the one with autism, he won't go to bed at night unless Isaac is in the room, right? So if Isaac's staying up late to watch a movie or he spent the night at someone's house, my son Jacob just says, "Isaac, Isaac." So
Oh, I love
cute. It's
that.
yeah, you can't it's just beautiful to see how God writes better stories than we do. That's what I always
Yeah, for
say.
sure. And one of the things that you say in your book that I love so much, and I bring a different perspective now because I'm a grandmother. And so I have raised 4 kids and I have 14 grandchildren. One of them has autism. We have one that's adopted. So I get all these topics. But something you say in your book, I would like you to talk about because I think it's so important that motherhood really helps us become unselfish. Talk to us about that.
Mhm. Yeah, well, I always say, if you wanna know if you're selfish, have a baby. It's like the
Yes,
perfect
right.
test, and you will be. 'Cause that we have this idealism about ourselves, right? Like, "Oh, I'm just such a loving, caring person," and then you have a child you have to care for 24/7 who wakes up in the middle of night, and you get no sleep, and you can't shower, and you suddenly realize, like, how your world does revolve around yourself, and how motherhood I always say motherhood, um, it like, the dying to yourself part of motherhood is one of the most beautiful things, right? Because it's purpose for our lives must exist outside of ourselves. And I think motherhood is that initial lesson of that. Like, man, like, this is so hard. Like, I think there should be a disclaimer, like, nobody told me it was gonna be this hard.
I've heard that
It's
phrase a
amazing. It's the
lot.
best thing I've ever done. But, like, there should be, like, a warning label on motherhood
Yes.
or something. But it's a beautiful thing. It's a hard, but it's a beautiful hard because I really believe God teaches us how to get to the end of ourselves and start living for someone else. And that's not just a lesson for the season that we're a mom, but I think it's a lesson God wants us to carry on for the rest of our life. Like you said, as a grandma or just even as a
Yeah.
Christian, because we don't really know how selfish we are until we start trying to live for someone else and we realize how incapable we are of it without the grace of God. But if we allow him to like just that continually like surrendering and dying to our own desires and self, it produces this, I mean, it's agape love, right? Like the love of
Mhm.
God. It's the love that doesn't have a hook in it. Like I'm going to give and give and give. And I think as special needs parents, you can feel that even more because sometimes you don't always get that return. You don't always feel, it feels like a thankless job to be a mom in general. But sometimes when you're, raising a child with special needs and maybe they can't vocally say thank you, or maybe, you're caring for them and caring for their needs way beyond the age you should have to do these things. Like, I still shower my daughter, like all of these things that feel like a thankless job, but they help us, I really believe, come to this place where we learn to lay down our lives. Jesus said there's no greater love than a man who lays down his life for a
Mhm.
friend, right? Like that's what we're doing as moms. And it's not glamorous, but it's so vital to change
Yeah, it is.
us.
And I think a lot of times moms, we probably all thought this, you give birth to that first child and you think, oh, God's going to use me to shape and mold this child, and
Mhm.
then, there's that pivotal moment where you realize, oh, wow, that's not happening. God's using this child to shape and mold me, and change me into who he wants me to be. And it's a beautiful thing, really, but it can be a little bit startling for moms, I think, in the journey. So, Jess, you actually gave a TED talk. So, what was your TED talk on? I love that you did that.
Yeah, so, I was called How to Win at the Race Called Life,
Okay.
and it was really just that whole thought of, at the end of the day, we have to learn. I use the running analogy, but we have to learn how to live for others, like, and how Jesus modeled that servant leadership, right? Like, everybody thinks, "Oh, I'm gonna achieve this or do that," or even just in motherhood, I want our kids to be. I think a lot of times what I realized is, like, mothering, kids on the autism spectrum, I realized that I was such a perfectionist. And it's almost like God used that to kill the perfectionist in me, to humble me so many times over that it's changed me in such a great way that I'm like the idea of like just serving and loving with no strings attached is like what he's trying to get us all to. But we think, even in our kids, we want our kids to achieve great things and we want them to be successful in life, whatever that looks like, and to love Jesus. And all those are good desires, but you start to realize that a lot of that really is about me.
Yes. Yes.
Like, that sounds horrible to say, but it's like, I want to feel like I did a good job as a
Sure.
parent. I want people to pat me on the back, and that it's not necessarily always even about our kids, that it's about the perception. And it's just so many times how God had to continually just humble me and realize that the way we win in life isn't about achieving and being this perfectionist, but it's about laying down our lives and learning to serve like Jesus did. And I feel like motherhood is the greatest teacher
Yeah.
of that lesson.
I do too, and so I want to go back to something you said because we do want our kids to grow up to love Jesus, right? We definitely can't control that, and I think it can present when a child has autism, it can present some challenges. Like, how do you explain Jesus to them? And I and yet I think it's another opportunity for us as moms to trust Jesus because at the end of the day, Jesus can reveal himself to children with autism quite well without our help.
Sometimes honestly, sometimes I think they're closer.
Yeah.
I don't know, this is my theory. I've seen it even in my own kids because there's an innocence in my kids that will never
Yeah.
fade. My kids are on the severe end. Like, my daughter is never gonna worry about what people think of her. She's never gonna feel peer pressure. Like, there's just so and we've just had these moments where I'm like I mean, one time she just had this dream where she's literally was talking about seeing Jesus riding a white horse, and I'm like, "What?" With a rainbow in the sky, and I'm like, "Where is this coming from?" Like, it's not like she saw it on a movie. She says, "Jesus on the white horse with the rainbow," and I'm like, "Oh, well, apparently Jesus is coming to you into your dreams," because I just think there's like, like I think of the verse, right? Jesus says, "Unless you're like a child, you can't enter into the kingdom of God," and I think there's an innocence and a purity almost in these kids on the spectrum that I think they see with their spiritual eyes sometimes better than we
Yeah,
do.
I think you're
And I
right.
think we get caught up. I think we get caught up a lot. We have a podcast for autism families. And one of the questions we got recently was like, how do I know my child with autism like has accepted Jesus or how should I get them baptized? And just some, real important faith questions. And it's funny because our kids are on the more severe end, it's like let's not even like we can't really have a conversation like that, but it really got me and my husband thinking. And it just made me really realize I just think they have spiritual eyes that we don't have. And I think they have a connection that we don't always see. I mean, my kids don't have a lot of words verbally, but I just think they can sense things, even when we are able to bring them to church. There's just I don't know how to explain it. It's like there's a connection there and it transcends just the natural.
Yeah.
And it's honestly a beautiful thing. And like you said though, at the end of the day, I think it's a trust too because I also can't make my typical teen
Right.
know and follow Jesus.
Right.
So it's like I can do what I can do on my part to raise them to love God, but it's not my responsibility for them. It's they make that choice and there's this kind of surrender when it comes to just our typical kids that I also think God wants us to translate to our kids even on the spectrum that I even just think about their future, right? Like one of the things I worry about the most is my kids' future. Like you said, who will care for them when I'm gone? What will happen if, they can't live with us at some point and where would they go and all of these like scary thoughts that can just paralyze you but it makes you go back to like no this like these children are on loan and I have to continually surrender all of my kids to God that their futures, their lives, my fears, it just feels more extreme when you face autism, but I think it's always there. We're just able to forget about it or not be as afraid about our kids' futures, but that same surrender and that same trust is required for typical kids as a kids with special needs. Like we just have to get that to that place in our heart where we're offering them up to Jesus and saying, "Jesus, they're your kids."
Yep. Yep.
He loves them more than we do.
He does, and I'm so glad that's a really good place actually for us to end, I think, Jess. I Hey, listeners, I wanna recommend Jess's book. It's Jessica Herblutt. Hopefully, I didn't massacre your name.
You're
And,
good.
the name of the book is Unlimited Motherhood. We will put that in the show notes. We are also gonna put in the show notes their podcast. Tell me the name of your podcast, Jess.
Yes, it's the Full Spectrum Parent
Yeah, and
Podcast.
I think that that is so necessary. And I want us to end just by you praying for the moms who are listening out there who are like, yeah, I don't know how to deal with the autism or I don't know how to deal with these adopted kids or I just don't know how to deal with being a mom right now. Would you pray for them?
Yes, absolutely, yes. God, we just come before you right now. And I just pray for every mom that's listening right now that maybe just feels overwhelmed in the circumstance they find themselves in. God, you know exactly where they're at, whether it's little ones that are running around, or it's a diagnosis, or a struggle that they're having, even with a teen that wants to go their own way. God, you see their heart, you see their struggle, you see them, God. And I just pray for supernatural peace, even as they're
Mhm.
listening to this right now, that we talked about that idea of like, I'm trusting my kids. I'm entrusting my kids to
Mm,
you, that I don't have to have all the answers and I don't have to be in control, God. We just surrender our children up to you. So I just pray every woman listening right now would just feel your
mm,
peace and your presence, God, and that they would just make that conscious choice once again to trust their children into your
mm.
hands. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Hey, friends, thanks for joining us today on The Connected Mom. And we'll have another session where we'll have another great conversation next Thursday, where we will hopefully encourage you to connect more deeply with God, more empathically with your fellow moms, and more intentionally with your child. Thanks for joining us.